Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to Semaphore Uncut, a podcast for developers about building great products. In this new episode, Darko, the podcast host, welcomes Gene Kim, Wall Street Journal best-selling author, researcher, and multiple award-winning CTO. Gene reveals the key to building high-performing teams. I hope you enjoy this new episode, and let's dive in.
Today with us, we have Gene Kim. Gene, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, I'm so delighted to be here.
Can you give us some, stepping stones through your career and how I ended up doing what you're doing right now?
I've been studying high-performing technology organizations for now 25 years, and that was a journey that started early in my career, back when I was a CTO and founder of a software company called Tripwire in the information security and compliance space. And so I wanted to study these kind of amazing technology organizations that had the best project due date performance and development, the best operational reliability and stability in ops, and the best posture, security, and compliance. And so, around 2010, I had the privilege of meeting, Patrick Dubois, John Willis, Damon Edwards, and the DevOps movement, and that was just life-changing. And so I left shortly after that, and I worked basically full-time trying to finish the Phoenix Project book. Yeah. And kind of the next kind of phase on that adventure was not just working on the DevOps handbook with them, but also getting to work with Jez Hummel and Dr. Nicole Forsgren on the state of DevOps research. And so that's the cross-population study that spanned 36,000 respondents over 6 years. And, that was just so amazing, just to sort of really understand what are the, just to get a picture of what do high-performing organizations look like and what are the technical practices, architectural practices, and cultural norms that enable high performance. But the last 3 years was just one of the most intellectually challenging periods of my life, working with Dr. Steven Spear. We wanted to ask, what is in common between, Agile and DevOps and Toyota production system, lean, resilience engineering, safety culture. And our conclusion is that there are all incomplete expressions of a far greater but very simpler whole. And it really explains why organizations work the way they do, both in the ideal and not ideal.
Semaphore has released the Flaky Test Dashboard to help you identify unreliable tests in your project. Identify which tests disrupt your pipeline and cost you the most, all in one place. Go to semaphoreCI.com/product/flaky-tests-dashboard to find out more.
I mean, for me personally, and through my much shorter career than yours, both the Phoenix Project and State of DevOps reports are industry giants, both of them are, referenced so many times. Just wanted to say that.
Oh yeah, no, thank you so much for the kind words. And I just, I can't overstate how much I learned.
We haven't mentioned the book that, recently came out, Wiring the Winning Organization. So yeah, I thought about this episode and, wanted to talk, a story behind the book. People, cannot recommend it enough, should buy the book and read it. So that's there. Maybe we can, touch upon the areas of books, absolutely. But I would love to, decipher, the story behind the book, and what was the inception of the idea and all that.
Yeah, so I remember in around early 2000s, I was at Tripwire at the time, and I was hanging out with one of the Phoenix Project co-authors, and we were reading the Decoding the DNA of the Toyota Production System paper together. And it was just dazzling. And so, we were thinking someday we'll be able to meet the person behind this. We'll be really able to understand kind of like at a better level, kind of the genius behind, all the magic that makes the Toyota production system work. And, I think the line that I'm just thinking back, the line that still stands out is that every person is a scientist. Every day they're performing experiments, things that the customer may see, but most of them they will never see. But it's really in the quest to sort of perfect, the system that they are operating within. And I remember it's 2014. The Phoenix Project had just come out the previous year, and we're working on the DevOps handbook, and that is like really behind. That was supposed to come out at the same time as the Phoenix Project, and then I go take a course from Dr. Steven Spear at MIT. My head blew up. It was just to fully understand kind of the work that he's been doing and its implications on the work that we do every day. So we had corresponded and talked for many years after that. Then it's really came down to, actually I was hanging out with him, and our wives were there, and they said, all right, it's time to write the book. And that's when it started. And then the daily, it became almost daily, every other day working calls that went for 3 years. And I can't overstate just how much I learned.
Different organizations that we know today have different values, different DNA. Some organizations, do change, but to which extent can they change?
In some ways, the book is really meant to be an indictment of leadership, right? And like we're saying in the book, there's really 3 layers. Layer 1 is kind of the object where we work, right? It could be the patient. The second is the tools and instruments we use. So that could be the editor, the IDE, the Kubernetes platform, the CI system. And then the third is what we're calling the organizational wiring or the social circuitry. And that's, or the architecture, right? Which, dictates, how do components in the system act and interact. And what's amazing is that in any kind of good to great transformation, whenever you see an organization go from, terrible to great, in general, the only thing that changes is layer 3, right? Same people, same capital equipment, same technology, same floor space. The only thing that changes is the management system, is the wiring. And that is something that, I guess you could say we're all responsible for it, but the responsibility lies in the leadership. And so I get very frustrated when, we try to change the system and, due to something missing, leadership, right? We can't get from here to there. And so the book is really meant to be, help kind of isolate that, is, really specific about what our leaders responsible for is, to make it possible for people to do their work easily and well. And if you're not doing that, you are enabling toil and hardship and dismal outcomes. The reason why the DevOps movement happened is that we had this ever increasing number of, functional specialties, it's dev, QA, security, operations, deployment, and the information flow required to coordinate that, which became so great that, essentially everything blew up, right? And you ended up with this need for this different wiring. And I think CI, automated deployments, those became a critical piece, right? To be able to better couple those components together and also decouple them, right? So that, the developers could work independently of the deployment people, who could work independently of the build engineers, the security engineers, and so forth.
In our industry, there's that element of ever increasing complexity. The number of components and layers and complexity, it's much, much higher. On the other side, you can make magical things much more quickly. Complexity does go up, and then there is a layer which is made and crystallized that suppresses that complexity and allows you to move to the next step. With that rising level of complexity across industries, how do you see that curve going?
Oh, yeah, no, it's interesting, and the answer is I don't know, but the reason why you need so many functional specialties who have to focus on like an ever narrowing level of discipline is that, that each one of them is so complex that you need like a PhD in that area, to be able to contribute. It's a trade-off that we make. It's the way that we are getting all these benefits, in our world. I think, abstraction is one thing, but I think the job of the technology leader is getting ever more complicated because now, you have ML ops, AI ops, you got these LLMs, you have, that's one more functional specialty that we have to integrate, into our work. And in some ways, it's actually very challenging because, there are many stories of, the AI ML people working primarily in Python notebooks. They're not using version control. And, so dev has to shift left, but also, they've never really had to be on pager duty. So you have to shift them all the way to the right. And you create, so I don't want to, I think it's very difficult to overstate just how radically we need to be rewiring, kind of how we work.
Yeah, I mean, specialization, further and further into narrower and narrower fields is the story of our civilization. So it's a continuation.
Absolutely. But I mean, so one thing I did learn, right, that I find is absolutely functional specialties are not going to go away. The trick is, how do we integrate them so that we don't end up with a sort of dev versus ops silo? And something I just loved Steve say was that the functional owner is responsible for the who and the how. The product owner of the thing of which you are integrating their work into, they're responsible for the what and the when. And so in the military services, they have a very similar construct about the functional specialty versus a combatant commander. At Google SREs have something very similar, right? They own the who and the how, and they get matrixed into the product teams, right, which dictate the what and the when, and so forth. So it's a great way to. It even determines how do you measure the success of the person. It's not fair, right, to measure the SRE based on the success or failure of the product, right? That this can be part of it, right? But primarily, right, they should be graded on do they do their job, right, and did they use that to help the goals of the that specific product line.
Yeah. Just quickly going back to what you were saying, what is being integrated now into our development pipelines to say with the ML and AI. Just a couple of years ago, it feels like a chisel and stone compared to today. What tools are available.
I've had this problem where for about 10 years I've wanted to write this thing that would go into my photos on my phone, because every time I listen to a podcast or a YouTube video and I hear something interesting, I would take a screenshot. And the hope is that someday I would go back in and sort of go exactly to the point in the podcast, and I would listen to it and I'd write something or go read a book or something. But in reality, right, they just go into my camera roll and die. And so I used the GPT-4 Vision API to you can send it screenshots of YouTube or a podcast player, and it will actually retrieve the podcast name, episode name, and the playtime. Right? I'm like, okay, let's go. So it's 12 steps, to feed it GPT-4 Vision, then another pass to get into JSON format, and another one to, here's all the podcasts I listen to. Which one is it? Here's all the episodes. Which one is it? And so forth. And I guess the big surprise to me was that feedback cycle is about 45 seconds. And I just found that was intolerable because, I was having a problem with an error someplace, an exception being thrown somewhere, but I couldn't tell where in the 12 steps it was happening. And some friends helped me sort of refactor that so that it was the 12 steps were split out so they could all be run in isolation and tested in isolation, often without, that external API side effect. And I cannot tell you just how much that changed my life, right? Because now you go from 45 seconds to 5 seconds and maybe even milliseconds. And it just reminded me of why not only is it important to be able to see what you're doing when you're doing it, but you have to have very fast feedback. And 45 seconds was intolerable. People are solving really tough problems with feedback loops of minutes, hours, days, weeks. And I just marvel at how they do it because I find that impossible and intolerable. And, I just think that, things like, CI, CD, being able to run locally on your laptop, without having to talk to the outside world. I mean, those are such critical skills, critical capabilities, to do anything, to solve any non-trivial problem. I mean, I trust that resonates with you.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we entered this, this business. It was exactly as what you were saying. I don't want to wait a minute and a half if I can get the feedback in 30 seconds.
Yeah. Right. But one of the things that drives me crazy, a lot of systems, even getting a correct configuration file, you have to wait 2 minutes to find out whether it's your YAML file is invalid. It's
Semaphore has released the Flaky Test Dashboard to help you identify unreliable tests in your project. Identify which tests disrupt your pipeline and cost you the most, all in one place. Go to semaphoreCI.com/product/flaky-test unpack-tests-dashboard to find out more.
I mean, one of the things which maybe to some extent connects to your book and the wider topic that you're researching. Generally in business, the feedback loops. Okay, you come up with some kind of strategy or a product direction or market direction, and then you feed into it. You work for many months, sometimes even a year, and you figure out, well, you need to turn the ship in a different direction, and the feedback loop is a year or many months, of investment in some area, and you will learn a lot. But you still maybe need you need to implement a different function, just building the emotional and mental strength to go through the slow feedback loops. That took a while for both me and my partner. So,
and I just thought of so many things that we had built that based on the tiniest bit of evidence or tiny claim that maybe a salesperson had, right? Saying a customer would says this is really important. Well, it turns out it was not important to the customer at all. It might have been just an excuse of why they didn't get the sale. Anyway, just I suspect you've had those moments where the cost of experimentation. It would sure be nice if we could just push that down a little bit.
We have the book. I guess it's a huge project, monumental project. And how do you feel when I never wrote the book? I suspect many of our audience listeners haven't. What's the feeling when you publish the book and then you continue from there? How do you sail from there?
Justify my answer. Let me tell you about my last year. It was a grueling year. And based on kind of the what we wanted the book to do, we had a print date and we were behind, and so it was just not. It was not an option for us to slip. And so we were having long working calls every other day, including weekends. It was just a grueling year. When the book came out, I wish we had more time to work on it, but I'm so proud of the way it turned out. I mean, I learned so much. And then there comes the promotion part. Mm-hmm. And I got to a point where I think my sort of head just melted, and I just had to hang everything up and just give myself a break for about a month and a half. But I have to say, over the last month, it's been just an enormously productive time. I'm finding myself so excited about. I think I can spend the next couple of years just kind of sharing what I've learned that either got cut from the book or it was just it just didn't make sense to go that deep in the book, and kind of retelling case studies through the lens of the terms that we use in running the winning organization. Can I tell you like one story, like Absolutely. One example? So like the metaphor I use all the time, and I'm hoping it's like the big takeaway of anyone reading the book is that there's this, I think, a metaphor that I think it's probably it's changed the way I view the world. And it's about Steve and Jean moving a couch. And, it's so easy to laugh at because you think there's no problem solving happening there. It's all brawn work, no brain work. And yet, Steve and Jean have to solve a lot of problems. Like, where's the center of gravity? To get through a narrow doorway, around which axis do they rotate? To get through a narrow winding set of stairs, who goes first? Do they face forwards or backwards? And you don't need consultants. You don't need focus groups. Just by picking up the couch, trial and error, fast feedback, experimentation, communication, coordination, right? They're going to figure out how to solve the problem. And but there's all these things that we as leaders do that could make their work more difficult. We can turn off all the lights, right? It's like, it takes longer, more dangerous, can damage the couch in themselves. But I think the more serious one is that we can do things like introduce a lot of background noise, like loud music, siren, or put in an intermediary between Steve and Jean so they can't talk to each other directly. We make them go through a JIRA work ticket or a work order or an account manager or a lawyer, right? And suddenly there's not enough bandwidth for them to effectively communicate and coordinate, so they can no longer act as a coherent whole. And so, I think that I think that is sort of like explains the DevOps movement, right? It's like, okay, we partition the couch so they could not effectively communicate and coordinate, that led to cross-functional teams and so forth. And, there's like two stories that I think the couch can explain, like the Amazon API pizzification that happened in the early 2000s, 2 pizza teams, right? Because when you have 3,500 software engineers all coupled to one couch, and to get anything done requires scores of everyone to have consensus, and no one has independence of action. So the solution was to partition the couch into microservices, right? That regains independence of action for the teams. And so, that's great, right? But then the couch can also explain kind of this other curious story, right, from Amazon Prime Video that seems contradictory, where they went from a microservices to a monolith. But in hindsight, it's very obvious why, because it's as if they chopped the couch into 2 small pieces, because all their time was spent in coordination and transport of data in and out of storage buckets and step functions. And so by gluing it all back together again, you now have locality and coherence, right? And you also reduce costs by 95%. And so I think it's just a very powerful metaphor to explain, coherence and coupling, which I said as an amateur architect, I spent 20 years trying to understand what is decoupling and why is it important? And, it was finally, about a year and a half ago that I finally understood, what it is. And the couch, I think it just explains, so many ways that we as leadership can get things wrong, right? When we make it difficult for the right people to talk to the right people in the right way, in the right time.
Yeah. Just one remark. I mean, I think that you said many times through the episode that you learn so much to writing a book. So that's just a very interesting thing. So it's not the process of like knowing a lot and then just sit down and write it from first to the last page, but you do learn through the process.
Yeah, in fact, I suspect. It's a very similar thing with podcasts, right? You do it to hang out with the best in the game and to learn. And I think for me, it's a very similar thing for books, right? Is that I do it to learn something from someone who is also the best in the game. And that's been the common thread in every one of these endeavors.
Great. Amazing. Thank you so much. So for these years to come, and maybe next couple of months or so on, is there a talk that you are giving at a conference? Maybe just some direction for our listeners, also in terms of book and more about your work.
Oh yeah. So I've mentioned I've been running this conference called the DevOps Enterprise Summit for 10 years. And so that's been renamed to the Enterprise Technology Leadership Summit. And we're doing a virtual event at the end of April. And that'll be targeted for the kind of European time zones. And then we have the in-person event. This will be our 13th event in Las Vegas.
Jim, thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Right back at you, and keep up the amazing work.
What a great conversation. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. Make sure to subscribe to Semaphore Uncut on your podcast player of choice so that you don't miss our new episodes. And stay tuned.